The next task after that, and Karl Rove just told you this morning what it is, as if you didn't know, was to face the next challenge as the new norm in international relations is put into effect somewhere else. And now that it's been established by this action, you want to know what it is? A couple of days ago, James Woolsey, who was former head of the CIA under Clinton and apparently is going to get a position in the new administration, he gave a speech in where I'm going to be tomorrow, in Los Angeles, where he informed the crowd cheerfully that we're now in the midst of World War IV. There's World War I, World War II, Cold War was World War III, now we're in World War IV, and we got to go over the countries that have been attacking us. He named two. He said Iran and Syria. Fascist regimes of Iran and Syria have been attacking us, and we finally realized it. So now we have to go after them. So maybe they'll be the next ones. Or another possibility is the Andean region, which is now surrounded by U.S. military bases, plenty of soldiers there, and it's a big energy-producing and other resource-producing region, and it's kind of out of control. So that's a possible target, and you can think of others. But you can be pretty confident that one or another is going to come along. There's no other way to continue with the strategy that's announced and they intend to implement. Remember, these are people who barely hold political power by a hair, and the only way they can hold on to it is by terrifying the population. That means there are things that can be done. People don't have to be terrified by imaginary demons. That's an educational and organizational task, one that's not easy, but certainly within the means of people who are concerned. Well, let's go back to last September. Right after it comes October, Congress declares that Saddam Hussein is a threat to our existence, like Nicaragua, and authorizes the government to use force. Something else happened in October, something extremely important. There was a meeting, a retrospective meeting in Havana, 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The people who attended were key participants in the October 1962 missile crisis from Russia, the United States, and Cuba. And there was a discovery that actually shattered them there. It turned out that the world they knew it was a very dangerous moment. Arthur Schlesinger described it as the most dangerous moment in history, which isn't an exaggeration. But they found out last October just how dangerous it was. It turned out that the world was literally one word away from probably terminal nuclear war. It turns out that Russian submarines were under attack by U.S. destroyers. They had nuclear-armed missiles. Two of the commanders assumed that there was a global war going on and called for the missiles to be sent off. If that had happened, there would have been a massive response by the United States, wiped out half of Russia. They would have responded out and wiped out the rest of us, and we wouldn't be here to talk about it. But why didn't it happen? One submarine commander countermanded the order. The Russian rules required 3 commanders to authorize nuclear weapons. 2 agreed and 1 refused. That's why we're here. That's how close it was. This is after a campaign of international terrorism that led to the crisis, aimed at regime change for the kind of reasons I mentioned, all very much in the news last October, very imminent, barely reported. I don't know how many of you know about it. It was barely mentioned. Who cares if the world was one word away from nuclear war after a U.S. campaign of international terrorism? What followed was an increase in the terrorism, and Dean Acheson's explanation, which I already read to you. Well, there are more important things than survival, like profits and power. That's what we learn from this. Immediately after this discovery, barely reported, a week later, October 23rd, there was a meeting of the United Nations Disarmament Commission, that's essentially the General Assembly. They passed 2 extremely important resolutions. One of them reaffirmed a 1925 treaty that bans biological weapons. The second was a resolution that extended a 1967 treaty banning the use of, banning the militarization of space, preserving space for peaceful uses. Well, why? Those weren't reported, those resolutions. I had a friend do a database check. Weren't reported. Why? The United States voted against them alone. The United States and reflexively Israel voted against reaffirming a 1925 ban on biological weapons and a 1967 treaty, now extended, to ban militarization of space. Well, you know, that's really dangerous, both of them, and very urgent. Shortly after, but not reported. Right after that, the U.S., the Bush administration killed a bioweapons treaty that was under negotiation, stunning the Europeans. Last minute, the U.S. stepped in and says, no, we're not going to allow any discussion of enforcement mechanisms for years. The reason, got to protect the secrets of U.S. pharmaceutical corporations. It's much more important than banning biological weapons. Probably there's another reason. It's very likely that the United States is carrying out illegal tests of development of biological weapons. A lot of scientists guess that that's the reason why they haven't been able, they claim that they haven't been able to find the source of the anthrax attack. It was traced back to a U.S. federal laboratory, remember. This is not like disarming Iraq. It's a U.S. federal laboratory. They claim not to be able to find the source. It's kind of hard to believe. But it may be, and it's been speculated by the Federation of American Scientists and others, that probable reason is that they're concealing some kind of weapons development program that they don't want exposed. Well, maybe not. We ought to find out about it. Right after that, the U.S. went on to infuriate even its closest allies in the World Trade Organization. First of all, by taking a very extreme stand, violating trade rules. Notice that that's another reiteration that's still following the script of the Reagan years. There's a lot of talk about free trade, but they were the strongest opponents of free trade in the industrial world. In fact, the Reagan administration was the most protectionist government in post-war U.S. history. They virtually doubled protectionist barriers in the United States. The GATT, which is the predecessor of the World Trade Organization, according to their analysis, Reaganite protectionist measures were 3 times as high as other industrial countries, very damaging to world trade, but you know, the most powerful state in the world does what it wants, and they're doing it right again. The Bush administration has broken some new barriers and protectionist measures, but much worse than that, and this really did amaze and infuriate Europe and others, is just a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. intervened to prevent efforts which had been agreed to by the other industrial powers, efforts to provide inexpensive drugs to people who are dying of treatable diseases, AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, and others. That's tens of millions of people who are dying from these diseases, and the U.S. intervened to prevent access to inexpensive drugs, again, because huge profits for heavily subsidized U.S. pharmaceutical corporations are a much higher priority. Well, you know, it doesn't make you popular. The U.S. also continued to and is continuing to undermine international efforts to reduce threats to the environment, which are by now universally recognized to be severe and maybe a threat to survival. The pretext for this barely conceal service to pretty narrow sectors of private power. If you take a look at the journal Science, the journal of the American Association for Advancement of Science, the lead editorial about a week ago was a bitter condemnation of the Bush administration climate change science plan, which does absolutely nothing. It does nothing to stop what just about every scientist who pays attention recognizes to be a very severe threat. Well, again, profits are more important. All of this engenders fear and hatred of the leadership, and maybe ultimately hatred of the society, which was regarded as just too dangerous. That's going to lead to efforts at deterrence. How do you deter a country which has overwhelming military power? Well, you know, every international affairs specialist can tell you, and does tell you, by proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and proliferation of terror. That's what the Bush administration is going to achieve. As I say, Osama bin Laden must be cheering somewhere. Well, go back to that intelligent Martian. If he has some concern for the human species, he might be watching all of this with some amazement and asking how long it can be that people who live in a free country are going to allow it to go on. Thanks. I'm told that there are a couple of mics around, so if you'd like to go to them and we can turn this into a discussion. You start? Okay.
Hi, Noam. I wanted to ask about if we accept, and as I think we should, this sort of call to action as privileged citizens, what your estimation would be of two possible actions we can work for within the kind of narrow political spectrum. You've talked tonight about the what was done by this administration and by some of the same people during Reagan-Bush, and you've also criticized Clinton, but not so much tonight. And I'm wondering how important it would be to try to work for the change from the Republicans to the Democrats in the next election, which is, you know, it's a measurable change, versus other possible political activities like, you know, campaign finance reform and that kind of thing.
Well, it depends what the Democrats are. So I didn't talk much. I actually did talk about Clinton. So the sanctions that have destroyed Iraq and strengthened Saddam Hussein and made the population dependent on him and prevented an internal revolt, that's Clinton.
Right.
Okay, and there's plenty more. Take another example, which is often another domain. Take a look at Brazil. It's very interesting. It's informative what's happening there, very informative. Brazil has a huge popular movement, left popular movement, nothing like here. They succeed, and they're very effective. The Landless Workers Movement, the Workers' Party, and others, the biggest popular movements in the world and the most effective. They managed to elect their own president. Pretty impressive guy. Now, just take a look at what's happening and think a little about history. There's a good reason why nobody studies history. It just teaches you too much. But take a look at recent history. 40 years ago, Brazil had a populist president. It was during the Kennedy administration, not like Lula, but, you know, mildly populist president. Kennedy administration didn't like him. They organized a military coup to overthrow him. It happened to take place shortly after the assassination, but had already been prepared by the Kennedy administration. It was hailed by Kennedy's ambassador as the greatest victory for freedom in the mid-20th century, while the generals were torturing and murdering. It imposed the first kind of neo-Nazi national security state in Latin America. That's the beginning of a plague that spread right through the hemisphere, ended up in Central America in the 80s. It's pretty awful. We ought to know all about it. This time, they're not calling for a military coup, although Lula's a much more threatening leader for them and has a mass popular support, organized support that Goulart back in those days didn't have. How come? Well, there's two basic reasons. For one thing, the activism of the last 40 years has changed this country as well as Brazil. People here wouldn't accept it anymore. Then nobody cared. You know, nobody knew, you didn't pay any attention. But a lot has been done in the last 40 years. It's a much more civilized country. It'd be very hard to carry that off now. There's a second reason. Here comes Clinton. They don't need it. Back in the 1960s, the only way you could prevent a populist movement was a military coup. Now you can do it by the mechanisms of what the world calls neoliberalism. Financial markets, the international financial markets can strangle them. Capital can flow out of the country. What's called by economists a virtual parliament of investors and lenders can make the actual decisions over what happens in a country. Its own voters are irrelevant. The virtual parliament does it. Yeah, that's thanks to the what's called globalization. The measures that have been introduced in the last 30 years, primarily, much of it under Clinton, which means that, so like when Lula went to Davos at the World Economic Forum and made a good speech about how we have to, you know, work on overcoming poverty and all kind of nice things, they cheered him. They thought, oh, that's nice, you know, because they know he can't do a damn thing. Because the minute he makes a move, the virtual parliament will strangle him. Okay, a lot of that is thanks to Clinton. Those are other ways of controlling people. I mean, you know, they might have alternatives, but they'd have to be almost revolutionary by now. That's what the global justice movements are about, trying to prevent the virtual parliament from destroying what's left of democracy by transferring power into the hands of the virtual parliament. Okay, we ought to know about those things too, and plenty of people do. That's why there's a big global justice movement. That's Clinton too, and there's more. Going back to your question, it's really hard to say. You know, it depends what the alternatives actually are. That's why I was quoting Dean Acheson, Kennedy administration, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the planning commissions in 1940. Okay, the spectrum is pretty narrow. It's not to say that it doesn't exist, and sometimes choices within it are important. But far more important than that is changing the spectrum. And the way you do that is by the kinds of activism that have changed the country. That changes the spectrum within which choices are going to be made. Ultimately, you want to go beyond that, but for the short term, that's, I think, what has to be done.
Given that our government is the most powerful government in the world right now, how could we best utilize that power to affect change, both in terms of like pertinent issues like nuclear proliferation, and in terms of changing human rights? And I guess most immediately I'm thinking about where do we go from where we are now with North Korea, given that we've already made the mistakes that we have in the past?
Well, first of all, I think the way to deal with the overwhelming military power of the United States is to dismantle it, not to use it. And it's a threat. So take, say, nuclear proliferation. Okay, that's dangerous. In fact, nuclear weapons are among the most likely things that will do us in. You know, it's pretty close. Came very close in '62, and that's not the only time. What do you do about nuclear proliferation? Well, there is a treaty. It's called the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which obligates the nuclear states, that includes us, to carry out good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons. Okay? And nobody follows that. Nobody's going to follow it unless the United States takes the lead. The United States is one of the main violators of the treaty. It's right through Clinton, incidentally. And one way to reduce the threat of nuclear weapons is to observe the provisions of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Another way to do it is to pay attention to the Security Council declarations that are selectively used to justify the war on Iraq. They don't only call for disarmament of Iraq. They call for, there's a paragraph which is very rarely quoted, which calls for disarmament of Iraq as a step towards elimination of weapons of mass destruction and delivery systems in the region. Okay, that's specifically referring to the U.S. offshore military base in Israel, which has hundreds of nuclear weapons and totally overwhelms anyone in the region in military force. That's what they're talking about. That's another step. Another way to do it is to follow the recommendations of the high-level congressional and other committees, which have pointed out that the major threat of nuclear weapons right now, at least, is what they call loose nukes. You know, Russia or Pakistan or somebody with nuclear weapons, tens of thousands of them, in fact, that are kind of getting out of control. Well, you know, there are small programs to try to do something about that, and but they ought to be huge programs. So there are many problems about nuclear weapons, and another thing to do is to stop encouraging countries to develop nuclear power, which is what they're going to do. All right, let's get to North Korea. I don't know what you're calling mistakes exactly, but the countries of the region have an approach that they want to follow. And we should be following their lead, I think. South Korea in the lead, and Japan and China basically agree with them, that this is a serious problem, very serious problem, and it has to be dealt with through diplomacy and through moves to somehow integrate North Korea back into the system, which is not a trivial matter. The framework agreement, this is one thing that Clinton did which was right, of 1994, if it had been implemented, would have taken steps, it was taking steps towards that. Well, that's been reversed. And we ought to go back and we ought to follow the lead of the South Koreans on this. It's dangerous. Right now, the danger of North Korea is not nuclear weapons. The danger is, the reason why the U.S. isn't attacking North Korea is because they have a deterrent. The deterrent is conventional weapons, massed artillery, which can destroy Seoul in 5 minutes. You know, I'm sure that at the Pentagon they're working on techniques for, precision-guided weapons that can somehow, maybe tactical nuclear weapons that can somehow take out that artillery. But until they can do that, they can't attack North Korea because it has a deterrent. And in fact, the U.S. is teaching the world a very ugly lesson now. It's telling the world, if you want to prevent us from attacking you, you better have a deterrent. If you're defenseless like Iraq, we'll go after you. If you're North Korea, which is a much worse tyranny and a much greater threat, but you have a deterrent, we're not going to go after you. It may not be the headlines here, but everybody in the world understands it. It's very evident. That's really bad. Behind that, there are other things going on. So you take a look at that region, Siberia, China, Japan, Korea. It's an integrated region. It has tremendous resources, mostly in Siberia, like energy resources. It has countries that need those resources, Japan, China, South Korea. The natural development, and one that's beginning to take place, is some kind of integration in which the energy and other material resources of Siberia are going to be used by the surrounding countries which are carrying out industrial development. The U.S. is very much opposed to that, does not want an integrated region to develop that will be out of control of U.S. global power. That's part of the background for what's going on in the Gulf, in fact. So yeah, that's in the works. There's a lot to be concerned about if you're really thinking about the future. North Korea is a threat, and the way to deal with it is by following the lead of the people who are right there, like South Korea and the other countries. And we can do a lot to reduce the threat of nuclear weapons by following our own treaty obligations. That'd be a good start.
Even radical extreme statists such as Bush and Company must share a basic sense of self-preservation along with the rest of us. But it seems to me that they too, at a very personal level, will suffer the likely consequences of their own actions, a dangerous course that they've initiated. Do these people believe that they'll escape by magic or by divine intervention?
Yeah.
Or does their extreme devotion to ideology prevent ordinary logical thinking?
No, it's logical.
And finally, is it important for us or not to understand what's going on in their minds if we want to change the world?
No, I don't think it's minor importance. The reason it's of minor importance is that this is close to a historical universal. You know, it happens that by now the stakes are much greater because the means of violence are so much greater. You take a look at history, it's been like this forever. You take a look at the history of war. I mean, very often, maybe like half the time, wars were started by countries who got destroyed. They're willing to, the leadership was willing to take the chance, you know. I mean, and it's not just recent. You know, people talk about the 20th century as the most horrible century ever, and in some ways it was. But you look at the wars in Europe, the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, it wiped out about 40% of the population of Germany. They kept at it. You know, for the leadership was just more important. Or take a look at, take more recent times. Go back to 1950, okay? There was one potential threat to U.S. security. No nearby. I mean, the U.S. had enormous security. You know, controlled the Western Hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the other sides of both oceans. There'd never been as secure a country, but there was a potential threat. The potential threat was only potential then, was intercontinental missiles with thermonuclear warheads. Okay? If anybody had been concerned with the security of the United States, they would have tried to avert the development of that technology. And very likely the Russians would have agreed. And not because they're nice guys, but because they were so far behind, they didn't want the technology developed. McGeorge Bundy, who was Kennedy's national security advisor, wrote the authoritative history of all of this and had access to, you know, all the internal documents and so on. He points out in his history that he cannot find any document which suggests that anybody even thought about it. You know, that they even had a plan or a thought about trying to avert the threat, the only serious threat to the survival of the United States. And the reason is you just don't think about that. You're interested in short-term power, profit, and gain, and the fact that it might destroy your country is kind of secondary. And that goes right through history, you know, except the main difference now is that the stakes are much higher, much higher. But the reasoning is pretty constant. So is it important to think what's in the minds of these particular guys? Yeah, maybe at some level, but it's more important to recognize that, you know, within a lunatic framework, decisions are made which are pretty rational. It's the framework that's lunatic. I mean, you could say the same about environmental destruction. You know, you don't know how far off it is, and nobody knows exactly what will happen, but by now it's universally recognized that it's extremely dangerous, and that the system, in fact, is kind of nonlinear. That is, a small change might lead to a huge effect, and so on. It could happen any time. That's known. Is anybody doing anything about it? No, because it's much more important to have short-term profit. Well, and in fact, if you think about what you're taught in your economics courses, that's right. You know, it's rational within a framework of thinking that's pretty much accepted. People are supposed to be rational wealth maximizers, right? You're trying to maximize your own wealth. Okay, that's what you're supposed to be if you're rational. Well, and the market, if it works perfectly in theory, is supposed to respond to the inputs from the participants. So your votes are your dollars, and your goal is maximizing your wealth. Okay, here's a simple question. How many votes do your grandchildren have in the market? None. You know, they don't vote in the market. Therefore, their interests are valued at zero in what's called rational behavior. So therefore, it's entirely rational to destroy the possibility that of a world in which they can survive if you can have more shoes. You know, it's essentially what it comes down to. It's a kind of a rational decision within a framework of complete lunacy, you know. And there's a lot in history that's like that. We should be concerned with those lunatic frameworks much more than what's in the mind of some person who's making decisions within them that may be pretty rational within a accepted framework. That's really important, I think.
Mr. Chomsky?
Is there somebody up there? I can't really see.
Yes, thank you. If you had to excuse me, a little feedback.
Could you wave an arm or something? I can't see.
If you had to recommend 4 or 5 publications that you think provide unbiased and accurate reporting, what would you recommend?
Outside of KGNU, you mean? I don't want to sound dismissive, but I really think it's the wrong question. Nothing is unbiased. You know, everything is presented from a certain point of view. If you're honest, you make your point of view clear. If you're dishonest, you pretend you're objective, and so on and so forth. And then it's really up to you to decide what you think is telling something that sounds reasonable to you. And you really ought to be triangulating. You know, you look at different things and see how the world looks from different points of view, and then you make your own decisions. It's just as if you're you're a chemist working on some problem in chemistry. There is nothing that gives you an unbiased point of view. That takes work, and it's a lot harder when you are trying to deal with human affairs. So, I mean, I know what I think is important, but it's really up to you to decide what you think is important. I mean, for example, I learn a lot by reading the Wall Street Journal. That's why I was quoting it. I mean, I can't stand what, we disagree on every imaginable topic. But if you read it, you can learn a lot about, first of all, what's happening, because they have pretty honest reporting. Remember, they're reporting for the business world, which has to have a semi-realistic picture of what the world is like. And you also learn what's being thought about in centers of power. That's important. I don't say that's the only thing you should read. I mean, I think you should read Z Magazine too, but from then on, you've got to decide yourself.
I'm next.
You're next,
Yeah.
okay. I lost track.
And I'm not going to miss this opportunity. I've been waiting for a long time. You mentioned that the next region that it's going to be in the eyes of the United States.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
You mentioned that the next region could be the Andean region. That the United States is going to go propagate the democracy and freedoms that we
like we've done in Latin America for a century. Yeah.
I would like you to give us Bolivia in the last 5 years, and I'm a Bolivian. I was born in Bolivia, but I'm a U.S. citizen now. Bolivia in the last 5 years has discovered quite a bit of natural gas, and it's probably that in the next 5 years we will get close to the U.S. and reserves in the American continent. And there's quite a bit of opposition about a project that has been taking place. The government is trying to implement a project that is called Pacific LNG, liquefying Bolivian natural gas and exporting it to Southern California. There's quite a bit of opposition about that project from local people because it doesn't it's not going to benefit Bolivia in any way. If you know anything about that, if you could give us a little bit more details. Mm-hmm. And also, I have a request from a lot of civic and organizations in Bolivia to invite you down there to give us an idea about the devastating consequences of the American free trade that the U.S. government is trying to propagate all over South America.
Well, I mean, you probably know more about Bolivian resources than I do, so I won't answer, but I doubt that the resources are on that scale. I think they're significant, but I doubt that they're on the North American scale. However, it is true that there are intelligence projections. A document you ought to read, it's public, is called, I forget the name, Global... It's in the year 2000, the National Intelligence Community, that's the CIA and the rest of them, published a projection for the next 15 years. If you want a reference to it, send me an email. It's got a website. Or you can get it under the CIA website if you look. And it's a long, detailed projection of what they expect in the next 15 years, and it's pretty interesting. Parts of it have to do with this. They describe the Andean region. They don't mention Bolivia, well, except that insofar as it's part of this region at the periphery. But the Andean region, they say they expect to be one of the main sources on which the U.S. will rely for its energy requirements. Not the only one, but one. That's why I mentioned that it's a possible target, aside from the fact that it's out of control. Bolivia, as you know, is almost out of control. It came very close to electing a populist president, and would have if it hadn't been for violence. There's a lot of opposition in Bolivia to the so-called drug war, which doesn't have a lot to do with drugs, but it has a lot to do with driving people off the land and things like that. And it's been a disaster in Bolivia for the population for almost 20 years now. Alternative development programs that have been talked about haven't been realized, as they haven't been anywhere else, and it's pretty bad news. And so, you know, a lot of tension and violence. The U.S., as I mentioned, has military bases all over the region, and undoubtedly is looking for, you know, there are plans to go further, including Bolivia. As to the free trade agreements, well, you know, there's one region where they've been implemented, North America, okay, Canada, United States, and Mexico, and that's NAFTA. It's opposed by the populations in all three countries. It was implemented over the objections of the populations of all three countries. It's one of Clinton's other achievements. It required a tremendous media campaign to prevent people from knowing about what was happening. I mean, to this day, 10 years later, the official position of the labor movement has not been allowed expression. Right? There's a lot of denunciation of the labor movement, but their own position, which was pretty reasonable, wasn't allowed expression, still isn't. But the population is still opposed. Back in at the Hemispheric Summit in, what was it, April 2001 in Quebec, that was supposed to be the summit that was going to establish the free trade agreement for the Americas. Okay, and they were going to, and NAFTA was the model. Everyone read the headlines. It's all about how magnificent NAFTA was. Now we have to extend the benefits to the hemisphere. Well, here's another propaganda achievement for you. The two major organizations, pretty well-known organizations, the leading human rights group in the world, Human Rights Watch, and the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, which is one of the major, you know, think tanks that does regular economic analysis. Both of them published major documents on NAFTA timed for release at the summit. Human Rights Watch their document dealt with effects of NAFTA on labor rights in the three countries. Economic Policy Institute document had experts from the three countries discussing in detail the effects on working people of NAFTA in the three countries. Had a friend do a database search on that. It wasn't mentioned in the United States, except for one op-ed in a small town newspaper. Well, why? Because Human Rights Watch concluded that NAFTA had been harmful to labor rights in all three countries, mostly Mexico, which is the most vulnerable. And the Economic Policy Institute give a detailed analysis in which they concluded that it's one of those rare agreements which had been harmful to working people, which means the majority of the population in all three countries. Most harmful in Mexico, which is the most vulnerable. And you don't want people to know that when the headlines are talking about how marvelous NAFTA is and how we have to extend it to the hemisphere. But if you read those reports, you get a pretty good assessment of what the effect of so-called free trade is. And it's not free trade. That's propaganda. It's a very special form of international integration which gives rights to investors, not to people. So under, say, NAFTA, one of the provisions of NAFTA, like the World Trade Organization, is that corporations are permitted to claim national rights. So GM can go to Mexico and claim the rights of Mexican businesses. What happens if a Mexican of flesh and blood that tries to go to New York and claim the rights of an American person of flesh and blood? You know, don't have to bother asking. That's just only one example of special rights that are given to private tyrannies that people don't have. When NAFTA was passed, it was implemented in 1994, there was another legislation implemented in 1994 by the Clinton administration. It was called Operation Gatekeeper. It militarized the U.S.-Mexican border. That's an artificial border, like most borders. It was established by conquest. The United States conquered half of Mexico. And the border has been pretty porous in both directions. Same people live on both sides. They've been moving up and back. Clinton understood that when NAFTA is passed, you have to block the movement of people, okay? Free trade, if you go back to Adam Smith, is based on free movement of people. But you have to stop that. And the reason is because they anticipated an economic disaster in Mexico that they were going to call an economic miracle. And it was going to mean there would be a flood of people from Mexico fleeing to the United States. And they got to block that, so they militarized the border. And hundreds of Mexicans have been killed since then trying to cross the border. It's one of the effects of NAFTA. These are not free trade agreements. They're agreements which provide, which are carefully calibrated to be a mixture of protectionism and liberalization designed for the interests of those who are designing them. That's not very surprising. The people who are designing them, mainly corporate sector, are designing them in their interest. It includes very highly protectionist measures and the kind of liberalization that will benefit them. But they're not free trade agreements, and NAFTA, at least, appears to have been harmful to the majority of the population in all three countries. There's no particular reason to think that if you extend it to the hemisphere, it's going to be any different.
Before I leave, I have to convey the message of some of the people that wanted to invite you there. And I know you're booked for the next 2 years or 3 years, but can I contact you somehow, and maybe we can discuss if you could do something, because they want to have you there, and they want to listen.
In Bolivia?
To it. In Bolivia.
Yeah, I have one of my many thick files of invitations is from friends in Bolivia.
How can I contact you?
You can just email me, but all I can do is add it to the file.
Okay, where do I get your email on the web?
It's the obvious one. Just my name, Chomski, @mit.edu, educational institutions. So just what you'd guess.
Thank you. I'll do that. Thanks.
Okay.
What's to prevent?
But I have to tell you that I'll probably have to send a form response. I mean, I get hundreds a day, and even spending 4 or 5 hours a night, I can't really respond.
We'll keep at it.
But so a lot of them have to say, if it's an invitation, just all I can do is file it.
What's to prevent Mr. Bush from carrying out a plan, which I believe is part of his national emergency policy, and that is to cancel the 2004 elections?
I think, these guys are pretty bad, but I don't think that's in the cards. I think that probably would lead to a rebellion in the country. Unless, with an exception, if some major terrorist action takes place, all bets are off. And I don't say that they're trying to stimulate one, but the policies that they are pursuing are increasing the likelihood of terrorist operations, and they know it. They read their own intelligence reports. They read CIA reports. They read what strategic analysts are saying. And they're almost uniform in saying that the policies that are being pursued are likely to increase the threat of terrorism. And the threat is severe. You want to know how severe it is? I recommend some reading. There's a high-level task force, Hart-Rudman task force, organized by the Council on Foreign Relations, which just came out with its report a couple of months ago on some title like Terrorist Threats to the United States. Like everyone else, they said the threats are going to be increased by the attack on Iraq. Everybody says that. But the threat, then they run through it's kind of like a cookbook for terrorists. It has a series of threats which I hadn't even thought of, and they're very extreme. So, for example, they point out, and they apparently unstoppable. I forget the numbers, but they point out that a huge number of containers, most of what comes into the country is in containers, container ships, I think it's tens of millions a year, some extremely high number. And those containers are uninspected. Okay, anything could be in them. Furthermore, there's no way to inspect them. They come from 3 or 4 places around the world, Singapore, Amsterdam, or maybe Rotterdam, and some other place. And if you tried to inspect them, you would back up commerce, for months. Trucks clogging all of Europe, waiting to be inspected. I mean, the whole economic system would collapse, especially if it's based on on-time production. So there doesn't seem to be any feasible way to inspect them. Any one of them could have a nuclear weapon in it. It'd be put together in some, New York hotel room. And it goes on with threats like this. I mean, if you're going to try to create a world where people want to destroy you, they got a lot of ways of doing it. And if a terrorist attack takes place, I think all bets are off. This is a very frightened country anyway, and if anything happens, it could go berserk.
Do you consider
I don't.
tax resistance by Americans to be an appropriate means of expressing dissent and possibly affecting transformation in the government?
Well, I mean, I was a tax resistor myself for a long time. And in fact, I didn't work, tried to organize national tax resistance back in 1965 with a couple of friends. We really tried hard, didn't get very far. And I myself kept at it for about 10 years until I realized it's just not an effective tactic at that point. These are tactical questions. You have to try to judge, is it going to reach people? If you carry out any form of civil disobedience, whether it's tax resistance or something else, you have to ask, what are the likely consequences? I mean, you're not making a pact with God. You're trying to have an effect, Say, well, what are the consequences going to be? Is it going to encourage other people to do something, say, because they'll see you're doing this? And right now, my own I don't have any faith in my tactical judgment. Yours is better than mine, I'm sure. But if you want mine, it's that it's probably not an effective device now. Frankly, I think the most important thing now is to do something about the fact that this country is so terrified that an unscrupulous leader can impose lunatic ideas by a propaganda campaign that lead to real dangers. It seems to me that's what we ought to be dealing with. We ought to also be dealing with the fact that really critical and important things are just not reaching people, like what happened last October, say. Is of extraordinary importance, just one example. Unless that stuff is known to people, you're not going to be able to organize and have an effect. And that means breaking through media monopolies, information control, indoctrination, all sorts of things. Dealing with that seems to me a lot more important than things like tax resistance right now. But it's your guess.
Thanks. I really appreciate your coming, and I hope to see you back in the area soon. But my question was very similar to hers, actually. But I wanted to know your opinion, given all the recent events of the past few years worldwide, the opposition to some of the decisions the Bush administration has made, the WTO violations. If this invasion in Iraq continues and becomes drawn out, and you can just go on to imagine what could happen next, you don't think there's any chance for an international crimes court to bring charges against officials under the Bush administration?
At this point in time, virtually none, because the U.S. is just too powerful, and there isn't enough internal opposition. Frankly, I'm amazed that the war's going on this long. I thought it would be over in 2 days, if you look at the relations of means of violence, and I still suspect it's going to end very quickly. But if it does drag on, there's going to be enormous protests, and there could be all sorts of things happening. I mean, right now there's tremendous anger and hatred all over the world, and it's probably going to manifest itself in action. But I don't think an international criminal court is in the cards. And it doesn't seem to me it's our concern, really. Our concern is to change this country. not to speculate about what somebody else is going to do. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm afraid this has got to be the last question, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, really, thank you.
Name and where are you from?
Yeah, you can.
Okay, all right. I'm Joy Barrett, and I'm from Boulder.
And what brought you here this evening to hear Noam Chomski?
Because I've been a fan of Noam Chomsky's for the 20 or so years that I've been paying attention to international events, and I came to be educated and inspired. And also, I take great comfort in being, in these troubled times, surrounded by people who care about these issues. So it was a really good gathering in that sense.
And what was the night for you information-wise? Was there anything in particular that surprised you or struck you about the evening? Again, or maybe we can add to that, information-wise or community-wise.
Community-wise, I was pretty on top of the things that happen. I've worked with KGNU for a very long time. For most of it's 25 years. So there weren't a lot of surprises. Some of the facts that Professor Chomsky stated were new to me, and I can use them for ammunition in debates with people. And also some of the questions, the issues that came up in the questions, like the U.S. government being so ludicrous as to decide that they would invade the Netherlands if the International Criminal Court ever tried to try someone from the U.S. That just shows the extent that these guys are out of touch with reality and will also go to great lengths to make sure that they consolidate power, that they maintain power. Issues that scared me the most are, well, Professor Chomsky reinforced my fears that I had back throughout the 80s and the 70s, but let go of a little bit in the 90s, that ultimately we may all end in nuclear annihilation. That is so real a threat. And so where to go with that is just to work even harder to try and keep that from happening. His main message tonight to me was change has to happen here, and we have to become a true democracy, an active democracy, an educated and informed populace. And so, as I said earlier today in a rally where I gave a talk, our task is huge. It's to educate people with the truth. There are good people in this country, but they haven't got information, and that's what our job is. So I came here to get some tools to go out and educate people and get them to make better decisions democratically.
Thank you so much. And was there anything in particular about this evening that particularly struck you?
I'm always taken by the clarity of what Chomsky has to say. You know, he makes things very understandable, and he just says it in such a way that it's not antagonistic. You know, he doesn't throw it at you. He just gives it to you in a way that you can digest it.
And is there anything in particular that you see yourself inspired to do that you haven't been doing as a result of being here tonight? You can be honest.
Yeah, well, I'm always inspired to try to do more. You know, I've written letters and I've, you know, made phone calls. It's confusing. I mean, frankly, it's really confusing. It's hard. The problem is so overwhelming that it's hard to know which direction to turn. What you guys are doing, I think, is a big plus. Free Speech TV. I always kind of gravitate towards the fact that we're not getting the information. We're not getting this. We're not getting it on the media. We're not getting it on the radio, on the TV. And I really think that if you could break that barrier, if you could get venues out there that 90% of the people don't get to see, that, you know, what would happen would be exactly what we were told would happen. Public opinion would change, people would become more educated, and they would take matters into their own hands, and the government wouldn't be able to get away with what they're getting away with. So, as far as me being inspired, yeah, I'm always inspired. But it's a hard road. It's hard to know which direction to take.
And what brought you here this evening?
It's
Tonight I came to see Noam Chomski speak to citizens of Boulder because I think that he shares my ideals and values. And in this time, we've been at war for about 12 days now, and lately I've been feeling demoralized and sad, and I'm losing hope. And hearing a strong voice of Noam Chomsky really makes me to feel like there are people in the world who believe in peace just like I do, and facts to back that up, and that makes me feel comforted in this difficult time.
And as if that's enough, is there anything in particular that you feel you're going to take from this evening and bring out into the world or bring into your personal life?
Well, just being surrounded by about 2,000 people who live in Boulder and support the ideas that Noam Chomsky stands for. It's really a wonderful experience tonight, and so I'm going to go home remembering that I'm surrounded by people in this community who share my values, and that gives me a lot of hope.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
With information that would never be reported. Disregard the mainstream, media distorted. We come and listen and support it. Live and direct, we come and never pre